Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, is the official companion podcast to the upcoming MPB original documentary, focusing on the life of Medgar Evers. The companion podcast, hosted by me, Rita Brent, will feature in-depth conversations, extended interviews, and exclusive archive footage not shown in the documentary. Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, video and audio episodes premiere September 18th. Find it on mpbonline.org or wherever you get your podcasts. MPB, your stories, our mission.
The nation's longest-running traveling celebration of traditional arts, the National Folk Festival, comes to downtown Jackson for the first time, November 7th through the 9th. A fun-filled weekend for the entire family, exploring roots, richness, and variety of American culture. Non-stop music and dance, folk life demonstrations, hands-on children's activities, signature Southern foods, crafts, and more showcasing the best of America, the best of Mississippi, all free. We'll see you in November. More at nationalfolkfestival.com.
Russ Latino, where we explore the ideas and people that are shaping Mississippi's future. We've got a great guest today, former House Speaker Philip Gunn. Before we get to our guest, though, a little bit of news and information. Last evening was the special elections across Mississippi in multiple Senate and House districts that had been court-ordered. Very truncated period of campaigning that occurred. By and large, things fell in line the way that people expected them to. There were three particular Senate races that were involved in Republican primaries that were very widely watched and commented on. One up in DeSoto County for Senate District 1, where incumbent Mike McClendon had faced what people believed was going to be a stiff challenge from another Republican, John Stevenson. Stevenson had some success in building a fairly broad coalition of mayors and other elected officials in the DeSoto County area to come out and endorse him. At the end of the day, that did not matter. It did not overcome McClendon's incumbent advantage, if you will. He won nearly 2-1 in that race. Senate District 44, which is around the Hattiesburg area, was one of the districts that the court had ordered redrawn for a new election. And in that race, incumbent Chris Johnson faced a tough challenge from Mr. Lott in Lamar County. The end result of that, though, was that the incumbent won there. The big upset of last night, and it wasn't particularly close, was in Senate District 42 in Jones County, where incumbent Senator Robin Robinson was defeated last night by Don Hartness in the Republican primary. That is a race that in large part centered around questions around Robinson's vote in support of a redistricting plan that split up the Jones County Judicial District. And then you had Chris McDaniel, also, who is from that area, come out pretty strongly on behalf of Don Hartness. The rest of the races largely fell in line. This morning, Governor Tate Reeves summarized the races last night by saying that it was a referendum on Medicaid expansion, pointing to the fact that two of the people who won in those contested primaries had voted against Medicaid expansion, and two people who were being sent home had voted in favor of Medicaid expansion, and that obviously will cause a little bit of controversy and conversation. All that said, I'm super excited to have Philip Gunn in today, former Speaker of the House. Watching the elections last night, watching this process unfold, were there any surprises on your end?
Well, I think what you said is very accurate. You summed it up very well. I don't know what people know about redistricting or how that happens. Just very briefly, we do a census every 10 years as a nation, and the law requires our legislative districts to be redrawn. There are population shifts that occur. Some areas grow, some areas die. And in the legislature, we have 122 House members and 52 Senate members. And each of those members is supposed to represent an equal number of people. And so every 10 years, we have to redraw those lines to get those numbers back in line. DeSoto County is the fastest, largest growing area of the state. Other growth areas are the coast, Hattiesburg, Madison, Rankin, Oxford. Those are all growing areas. Other areas that are in decline would be the Delta and some of the rural areas. And so you have to redraw those lines. When the maps that we drew on the House side back in 2020 or 2021 were pretty well approved. I think there were only 2 races that had to be rerun, and one of those was in yesterday, an incumbent one, and then there's some general election races coming. But the Senate is where the big problem was, and they had to how many races? 15 that they had to rerun?
It wasn't quite that many, but yeah.
Well, I think in the general election they're going to have some more.
There are a few more in the general, yeah.
So they had quite a few. And so that's what happened yesterday. And the primaries, the general election will be in November. I think you summed it up very well.
You know, it struck me watching it. I mean, one, if you looked at that DeSoto County race, I mentioned this, there were an awful lot of mayors that came out in favor of the challenger, local elected officials. One of the things that I was reminded of looking that way, like when you run a race, you got to win your own race.
Yes.
This whole sort of grab and hold the coattails thing, in very rare instances does that ever work.
I agree with that. Very rarely does that work. And that's why you see most politicians not engage in other people's races.
And you know, the other thing that strikes me, I mean, obviously we live in a social media age where a lot is done over social media, but sometimes that can be very misleading. So if you were watching some of those races on social media up until last night, you might be of the impression that one side was going to overwhelmingly win. And then you look at the vote tally, and it's the exact opposite of that perception.
That's exactly right. Social media is not the place to get your information. It's a good place to be entertained, but it's not an accurate source of information.
Well, and you know this from when you were in the legislature, right? It kind of becomes an echo chamber, right? One person gets mad about something.
Yes.
And then it swells, and you start to think, well, everybody must be mad about this. And in reality, the vast majority of people don't even know what this is.
That's exactly right. And if you study it, sometimes it's the same 4 or 5 people just stirring it up. They're just batting like a tennis match, batting it back and forth to one another. And you may see 300 comments, but it may be 10 people making those comments. So you got to pay attention to that.
Yeah, there are days, and look, I'm guilty of this because I do think we have this online world now, and really younger than my generation, you know, a lot of people spend a lot of time online. But there are days where I'm like, how do people have the time to invest this much energy arguing with each other?
That's the same thought I've had. What are these people doing? Do they not have jobs? I mean, come on.
So it's good to see you. Obviously, you've been out of the fold, if you will, for a couple years now. How does it feel to be a civilian?
Well, you know, I loved my time in the legislature, and there are days where I miss it. I enjoyed being a part of shaping policy, shaping what I felt like made Mississippi better, moving Mississippi forward in a number of directions. It's good to take a breather, though, and refresh, and gives you a new perspective. There's less stress, obviously, being not involved. But it's good to get a breather, and yet I remain involved, and I continue to watch what transpires and try to help where I can.
So you were first elected in 2007, is that right?
2004. Yeah, the election of 2003 and sworn in 2004, yeah.
Okay. And, you know, I think a lot of people maybe don't realize this because if you're of a certain age, let's say you're 30 years or younger, there's this perception in Mississippi that Republicans have been running things forever.
Oh gosh.
And the reality is that, like in your case, you know, Republican control of the Mississippi House of Representatives didn't take place until 2012.
Correct. That's right. Just a quick history lesson there. You know, the Democrats held control of the Mississippi House from 1876 till 2012. 136 years, Democrats held control of the Mississippi House. And so it wasn't until 2012 that we were able to finally get a majority of Republicans, and we barely did. We only had them by 3 votes. As I said a minute ago, there's 122 members in the House. Half of that is 61. So a majority is 62. 62 is the magic number. That's where you try to get to. Then you're in the majority. We got 64 in that election in 2011. I'd like to go back to about 5 years before that, though. When I got elected in 2003, started in 2004, we only had 45 Republicans. So as you can see, we were well short of the 62 magic number. And I began to notice that the Republicans had a hard time staying together sometimes on some particular votes. There were many Republicans who were very much concerned about voting with the leadership, which that time was Democrat. And so you'd have a vote that would come up on what I thought would be a very conservative, obviously Republican bill, and you'd have 15, 20 Republicans vote the other way. And I expressed frustration about that to a couple of the senior members. I said, what is the deal? And they didn't know. And we, in 2006, had a vote on something. I don't even remember what it was now, but it was clearly a Republican vote, and 20 Republicans voted with the Democrats, and I just got exasperated with that. So I went to a couple of these two members, and I said, we got to do something about this. And that night, they came over to my house, and I ordered pizza. My wife was out of town, and we talked about forming a caucus. Should we caucus? And we decided that was the thing to do. So we went to Haley Barber the next day and said, we think we need to form a caucus, something that gives some unity to the Republicans, something that allows us to have a family, a place that we can all stay together. And he said, that's a good idea. So we did. We made a list of other members that we thought would embrace the idea, and we brought 4 or 5 others in and pitched that idea, and they embraced it. And so in 2006, as a result of that, we formed the Republican caucus. Now, I'd like to think that laid the foundation for what happened in 2011 when we finally were able to gain a majority in the House. We set out on a course there in 2006 by forming a caucus that provided a place of unity, a place where we could discuss issues and let others know you're not alone. If you vote the conservative line, you've got 44 other members who are going to stand with you. And that began to strengthen us. And when we entered that 2011 election, we had 54 Republicans at that time. And then we flipped 10 seats, or a net gain of 10 seats to get to 64. And we took over for the first time in 136 years. And so we immediately began to implement conservative policies at that time. And that's the first time in 136 years that Republicans had the governor's office, the Senate, and the House. And over the next 12 years, I think we put forward a lot of good policies that have moved Mississippi forward in a number of directions. I like to say we did more in 12 years to move Mississippi forward than the Democrats did in the previous 136.
We're talking with House Speaker Philip Gunn about the transition that occurred in the Mississippi House of Representatives just 13 years ago at this point. We've got to take a brief break. When we come back, I want to talk about a little bit about why you think that transition occurred. What in the political environment led to that change from a hardcore Democrat majority for that length of time to now Republican dominance? You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. We'll be back in just a moment.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Every parent wants their child to grow, to explore, and to dream big. At MPB, we're proud to support families and teachers across Mississippi with trusted educational programming and resources that inspire learning and spark imagination. From PBS Kids favorites to digital tools and early learning support, MPB is here for young minds, engaged classrooms, and families who believe in the power of learning at every age. Empowering families, inspiring learners. MPB, your stories, our mission.
The nation's longest running traveling celebration of traditional arts, the National Folk Festival, comes to downtown Jackson for the first time, November 7th through the 9th. A fun-filled weekend for the entire family, exploring roots, richness, and variety of American culture. Non-stop music and dance, folk life demonstrations, hands-on children's activities, signature Southern foods, crafts, and more showcasing the best of America, the best of Mississippi, all free. We'll see you in November. More at nationalfolkfestival.com.
You're listening to The Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. Today, my guest, former House Speaker Philip Gunn, taking a trip down memory lane from his time in the legislature and his time as Speaker, and really kind of reflecting on what led up to the change from what was a 130-some-odd year period of Democrat control in the Mississippi legislature to that time in 2012 where Republicans were able to take the majority of the House. They haven't surrendered it since. What do you think was the catalyst for the shift from long-term Democrat control to Republican control?
I think it's two things happening simultaneously. The first thing is I believe we as a state overall are a conservative state, and Republicans carry the conservative banner. We are the party of conservative policies and issues, and they work. So I think many of the people recognize that. The second thing is the Democratic Party just drifted so far left and seems to continue to do that today. And many of the people, we had a lot of party switchers. I said a minute ago, when I got elected, we had 45 Republicans. And in 2011, we had 54 when we entered those elections. Well, do you know how we got from 45 to 54? We had 9 Democrats switch. And they could no longer find commonality with the Democratic Party, the things that the Democratic Party was advocating. And I would go to party switch announcements all around the state with sheriffs and circuit clerks and supervisors. And I just, out of curiosity, say, why are you switching? And many of them would say, I can't agree with the things that the Democratic Party is promoting today. And they were looking more at the national Democratic Party.
So that's what I was going to ask you.
It wasn't the local Democrat, but the national Democratic Party was just taking on issues that were just so far to the left that mainly in the social arena, that just don't line up with Mississippi values, and they just couldn't take being a part of that anymore. So they found a home in the Republican Party. And we've seen many of the counties around the state that used to be Democrat now have Republican county officials, supervisors, and clerks and whatnot. And I think that's what happened, and particularly in northeast Mississippi, because the coast was pretty well Republican, and Hattiesburg and the Jackson area, but northeast Mississippi was where you had the big switchers that went from the Democrat Party to the Republican Party. And since then, I think today they've got like 79 Republicans in the House. So it's just, once we got across that threshold, the floodgates just opened, and they've got what we call a supermajority now, which is more than a 3/5 vote. And we can talk about that if people care to understand how votes are passed in the House.
Arcane rules.
Not every vote is a majority vote. It depends on the type of bill that it is. And so the media and others make a big deal out of the supermajority. And what that means is any vote on a tax bill, a fee bill, anything that proposes to implement a tax or a fee or reduce a tax or a fee is a 3/5 vote, which is 74 people in the House of Representatives. And so when you get 74 Republicans or beyond, theoretically, you don't need any Democrat help to pass a tax bill or a fee bill. And so that's what we call a supermajority. And we enjoy that now in both House and Senate in the Mississippi legislature.
Yeah, and maybe I'm the only one. I find all that stuff fascinating in terms of party realignment and shifting. Like, I'll have a conversation with Jerry Nash or Andy Taggart or something about this stuff, and it's like, at some level, Democrats in Northeast Mississippi were what I would call TVA Democrats or Roosevelt Democrats, sort of the old yellow dog model.
Right.
And I think the point you made is an important one, which is it seemed like the National Democratic Party shifted away from some of that and kind of left those people feeling like they didn't necessarily have a home.
Right, and mainly in the social issue arena, gay marriage, abortion, those types of issues. Those people in Northeast Mississippi, for the most part, are very much pro-life people. They are not for abortion. They are not for gun control. They are not for gay marriage. And so when the Democratic Party began to embrace those kinds of things, those folks just kind of got left behind. On an economic side, they were a little bit different than Republicans because they were very much for economic distribution, wealth redistribution, that sort of thing, which is not what Republicans generally stand for. So that's I think people like to say, what was what was your trick to growing the Republican Party in Mississippi? And I'd like to take credit for that, but I think the Democrat Party on a national level helped us more than anything else.
So it's interesting. I moderated a debate, and I think it was for a special election, where you did have both Republicans and Democrats on the stage. And one of the very first questions that I asked was essentially, who here is pro-life, and everybody raised their hand, including self-identified Democrats.
Right.
And then I'd say, well, who here is pro-gun? And everybody raised their hand. And I literally, in the course of that debate, said, okay, then I'm not going to ask any of you questions about those things.
Sure.
Because there seems to be consensus around those issues. I don't know if that's as true today as what it was 15 or 20 years ago. Obviously, you got a new generation, different thoughts around some of those things. I think there's also a set of different thoughts around what it means to be conservative or Republican, or a lot of debate about what it means to be those things these days. How do you define what a conservative is?
Well, I think the word conservative means to conserve. What are we conserving? What are we preserving? I believe I use this illustration in my speeches all the time. When our Constitution was created back in 1787, Benjamin Franklin walked out of the Independence Hall, and a lady said, "What have you given us, a monarchy or a republic?" And he said, "I've given you a republic if you can keep it." And I've often thought, what did he mean by that? What did he mean by if you can keep it? And I've got a speech I give that expounds on that, and I won't give that speech here. But in part of that, it's we call ourselves conservative because we are trying to conserve what we believe to be the best country in the history of the world. And the things that make us the best country are maximum freedoms that any society has ever enjoyed in the history of the world. We have a republic. We elect people to speak for us. We have a system of checks and balances that keep any one particular person or party from having unfettered control. So for me, conservative is limited government. I'm big on trying to rein in the powers that government have. Government is necessary. I'm not one of those people who thinks government shouldn't exist. The Bible creates government. There's three institutions God creates in the Bible: marriage, church, and the government. So government is necessary. Taxation is necessary to perform the functions that government must perform. But I think we have to be very limited in what we believe those functions to be. And I think the leadership we provided over the last 12 years or so in the House reflects that. The spending that we did. We got spending under control when we took over. When we took over, there was a deficit of $600 million. We dug out of that. Tate Reeves is on the Senate side. I was on the House side. In 3 years, we dug out of that. And we stayed within our means for the balance of our time of service. We never spent more money than we had. We conserved the amount of money that the taxpayers. We gave the largest tax cut in history. We gave money back to the taxpayers. I believe in personal responsibility. I believe that people ought to have, with maximum freedom comes maximum responsibility. And if you're going to enjoy maximum freedom, then you got to be a responsible individual, and you got to be a giver, not a taker. You got to engage in society. You got to be a productive citizens to those who can. Get a job and work. We got too many people who don't want to buy into that type of work mindset, work mentality. So those are just some of the things that I think makes a person a conservative. I think we have to look at conserving the greatness of our country and not allowing it to be whittled away by those who wish to undo the Constitution.
When you look at the state's political atmosphere, where you've got clear Republican dominance, super majorities in the legislature, all the statewide elected officials are Republicans, is there any downside to that level of dominance? And I know this is a hard question because you are a Republican, but I'm just curious if you look at it and say there's some risk in having one-party rule.
There probably is, but I think you have to look at the results and what's happened. Yes, everything's not perfect, and you do have people who call themselves Republicans who are not true Republicans. They're not true conservatives. They still advocate for some of the things that we as Republicans don't necessarily buy into. But on the whole, look at the things that have happened over the last 12 years to move Mississippi forward. And I think it is clearly a result of Republicans being and bringing to bear conservative policies at work.
So we got to take a quick break. But one of the things I want to talk about on the other side of the break is the fact that there have been some moments of unity where Republicans and Democrats have worked together. One of those things is the changing of the Mississippi flag. Obviously, I know you were very involved in that. I want to delve into that a little bit, maybe talk about the tax policy a little bit.
Okay.
We're visiting with House Speaker Philip Gunn right here on the Sit Down on MPB Think Radio. We will be back in just a moment.
At the Mississippi Arts and Entertainment Experience in Meridian, we believe in the power of the arts, storytelling, and education, just like Mississippi Public Broadcasting. MPB connects communities across the state with quality programs that inform, inspire, and engage. Their audience is loyal and appreciative of businesses that support public broadcasting, which makes underwriting on MPB a smart investment. Join us in supporting MPB. Learn more at mpbfoundation.org.
Together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, is the official companion podcast to the upcoming MPB original documentary, focusing on the life of Medgar Evers. The companion podcast, hosted by me, Rita Brent, will feature in-depth conversations, extended interviews, and exclusive archive footage not shown in the documentary. Everlasting, the Legacy Podcast, video and audio episodes premiere September 18th. Find it on mpbonline.org or wherever you get your podcasts. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Listening to Sit Down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino. Talking today with former House Speaker Philip Gunn, who's been in what I refer to as civilian life for the last 2 years. You were asking me off air sort of my definition of conservatism, and I think about the Declaration of Independence, and I will butcher my paraphrase here, But, that line of the Declaration of Independence that talks about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed. What that means to me is, in my mind, rights come from God, not government. It's government's job to protect those God-given rights. And at the end of the day, government should be responsive to the people. And so I think our founders, for all of their flaws, and they had a great many flaws, set up an ingenious form of government that was limited in power because they recognized that power allowed for the invasion of individual liberty. And so for me, it's the ability to think, speak, and act according to my conscience, so long as I'm not harming another person. And that's the way I think of sort of the conservative ideal that plays out with things like free speech and free markets and the ability to go out and roll up. You talked about the value of work, the ability to go out and roll up your sleeves and apply your God-given talents to create value for other people. And I think it's what's made us the most prosperous and successful nation on the planet in human history.
Yes, I agree.
And so, I think there's a lot of debate right now about what that means and what are the limits. Kind of, we were talking off air. What are the limits of freedom, if you will, or are there limits to individual freedom? And I think those are all important questions, and we're grappling with a lot of that stuff now. When you look at, we kind of talked about partisanship a little bit before the break. And one of the things that I noted, you mentioned earlier that you were curious as to why some Republicans, when they were in the minority, were voting with Democrats. Now, when you were Speaker and now, Democrats very frequently voted with Republicans, right? You would very frequently see votes. You got 122 members in your chamber with 100+ votes on a bill. So when you were in that seat of power, was it more understandable that Democrats were actually working with Republicans to get some things done?
Well, I want to be clear here or clarify something for the people. Most of what people see of the legislature is what they see on television or some sort of news report or social media. 95% of the time, everybody's voting alike. You just see the controversial stuff on television. And we're not like Washington. I think in Washington it's probably exacerbated maybe, but here in Mississippi, many of my Democratic friends, as we talked about earlier, they are pro-life. So they share our views on the pro-life cause. They are pro-family, pro-marriage, and so they share our views on those issues. What you see on the television many times is just the controversial stuff that plays out, and don't believe that they don't get along all the time. We do get along quite well. I think one of the things that, a couple of examples. I think House Bill 1510, which we passed in 2018, which ended up overturning Roe versus Wade. I'm very proud of that. That's probably the most significant accomplishment during my time as Speaker, where we led the pro-life effort to fight for the unborn, and that bill worked its way up to the Supreme Court. There were quite a few Democrats who voted for that or didn't vote against it. Let's put it that way. The changing of the state flag brought so much harmony, I think, to the House floor. I think a lot of the people, you saw a good spirit of harmony that existed. That doesn't mean we're going to vote alike on every issue that moves forward, but the tension was removed from that. Those are two that come to mind where there was good harmony.
Yeah, it's interesting on the bill to restrict access to abortion that even once sort of you had seen Democrats move into the Republican column, that you still had bipartisanship around that issue. The flip side of that is, obviously in today's landscape, y'all's decision to pass that bill is super controversial, not only in Mississippi, but now nationally. People, a lot of people look at that and see it as the erosion of their rights. How do you respond in an age where there's not as much consensus around being pro-life? If somebody were to look at you and say, no, actually what you did was horrible, what's your response to that?
Well, I go back to for me personally, my Christian faith. I am a strong believer that God is the creator and sustainer of all life, that life begins at conception. There is a DNA that created Russ Latino that is unique to Russ Latino. Nobody else in the world shares that DNA. And that DNA was formed at the moment of conception. That moment of conception is what became Russ Latino and Philip Gunn. That is a unique individual. God is the one that did that. And I think there's a very strong belief in Mississippi that we understand life is sacred. God is the creator of that. And that's what drives our political views on that. I like to think that my religious views, my understanding of Scripture, my Christian faith forms my political views. I think that's the way it ought to be. That's what you have a faith for. It determines how you behave every day, the things that you believe, the things that you advocate. So then for me, and I think for a majority of the House of Representatives that passed that bill, that was the driving force. They believed that we're fighting the good fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. And there was some, if you followed us, beginning in 2012, we began a fight for the unborn. We passed a number of bills prior to this one that were designed to protect the lives of the unborn. And every time we passed one of those bills, they would get an injunction entered by the end of the day, and they would get struck down. They would go nowhere. And so many of the members kind of got tired of fighting that fight. Why are we fighting this fight again? Because we're just like beating our head against the wall. It's going to go nowhere. The Supreme Court hadn't changed. The composition of the court is still the same. They're not going to overturn Roe versus Wade. And you expend a lot of political capital when you fight that kind of fight, because not everybody on that floor is pro-life. And so there'll be long, prolonged debates, a lot of emotion, a lot of spent feelings, and some members were like, why are we doing this again? Let's spend that political capital on something else. And the verse of Scripture came to my mind, Galatians 6:9, which says, let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up. To me, that was just a motivating factor, that let's not grow weary of doing good. Let's fight the good fight, because in due season we'll see a harvest from this if we don't give up. And so we passed that bill in 2018, and little did we know that was going to be the bill to work its way through the system. And in 2022, the composition of the Supreme Court did change. Donald Trump put 3 pro-life people on that court, and they ended up overturning Roe versus Wade. And let's keep in mind, all they did was return that decision on abortion to the states, which is the right decision. They let each state then decide for themselves what they want to do. So abortion was not outlawed in this country. That needs to be explained. It's still available in certain states, but it's not available in Mississippi. We had a trigger law that we passed back in 2007 that just said if a Roe versus Wade is ever overturned, then abortion would be outlawed in this state. So that changed the landscape of abortion in this country. So that's my conviction. That's what led us to do what we did. That's why we did that.
So if we were in an environment where 90% of the state disagreed with your decision and with the House's decision in 2018, would that change?
For Philip Gunn, it would not have, because my conviction was driven by my religious views, which surpass the opinions of the voters that I represented. For me, it was a decision between me and God, and I have a conviction that God had clearly states in His Scripture that He is the author and sustainer of life, and I'm more answerable to Him than to people who disagree with me on that.
You know, it's interesting, because I think this is a good conversation, because I'm genuinely fascinated by what motivates people to make political decisions. And I've always felt that of you, watching you, is that like you make decisions based on what you think is right and wrong, and not necessarily with the finger in the wind. But we're in this moment where some of the pushback to conservative sort of intermingling of faith and politics is to describe it as Christian nationalism, or even a theocracy, or the desire to create a theocracy. You know, and I would look at it and I'd say a theocracy is counter purpose to the idea of a free society, right? Like, you don't want government to literally say everybody has to believe this.
That is not the basis of Christianity. God did not command that. He had that relationship with the children of Israel. But I'm not an advocate of a theocracy. I don't think we ought to have a national Christian religion. I'd love to see that. I would love to see a revival in this country. I would love to see people turn to Christianity. But the government's role is not to implement that. But I think everybody who calls themselves a Christian should be driven by that Christian faith in every decision they make, in their family, in their jobs. It is go back to Benjamin Franklin. We mentioned him earlier. I read a book about this by Eric Metaxas, and in that book he argues that the creation of our country, where the people can govern themselves, was unheard of to that point in history. That to that point in history, you had some sort of tribal existence, like a nation joined together by culture and language, like Germans or Japanese or French, or you had some sort of dictator like Alexander the Great or the British Empire, something like that. But for the people to govern themselves was unheard of. So the question was raised, how did they or could they believe that the people would govern themselves? And the argument he made is because the people who started this country, many of them, even those who were not Christian, recognized a providence of some sort. You can see Benjamin Franklin referring to providence, and I don't think there's any evidence he was ever a Christian. And Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and others who did not profess any sort of Christian faith, yet they knew that the people did, and there was a self-imposed governance because people were religious in their views. They believed something higher than themselves, and so they behaved out of loyalty to their God or to their whatever they believed, and that's how they felt like we could be trusted to govern ourselves. And so the further you move away from that religious view, the less the people can be trusted to govern themselves because they don't have that self-governance imposed.
Yeah, at some level what you're describing is a social norm, right? It's not a government-imposed thing. Jonathan Haidt, he's a sociologist. He talks about like the things that unify a country are either common blood, common enemy, or common values. And at some level, I think what you're describing is this common values concept that used to sort of dictate what was acceptable or not acceptable in polite society, for lack of a better way to put it. We're talking with Philip Gunn. We'll take a brief break, come back and talk politics moving forward in our last segment. You're listening to The Sit Down with Russ Latino. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Ryder Town. When breaking news affects your family, when Mississippi needs answers, MPB is there. We provide real-time emergency alerts, trusted news coverage, and live broadcasts of emergency updates. Available on TV, radio, and online. MPB is on the air and by your side every day of the year. Because when it matters most, Mississippi turns to MPB, Mississippi's trusted source. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Hello, I'm Desiree Frazier, host of the award-winning news program, Mississippi Edition. We bring you conversations about the latest news from across the Magnolia State. Whether it's politics, healthcare, or education, you'll hear in-depth discussions on issues that matter to you. So join us each weekday morning at 8:30 on MPB Think Radio, or download the podcast, listen through the app, and online.
together through the years, together in the future. MPB, your stories, our mission.
Sit down right here on MPB Think Radio. I'm your host, Russ Latino, talking today with former House Speaker Philip Gunn, taking a trip down memory lane, also getting a little philosophical, trying to understand the contours of faith and politics. Not your average political interview, is it? So,
well, I think it's important, and I'd like to say that I do let my faith form my views on political issues. As we said off air, not every issue is a religious one. You know, how much money you spend on roads and bridges, I don't know if there's any guidance from Scripture on that. But for these issues that we call social issues, I think, and I'm not one of those who thinks you separate faith from your politics. There are many people who advocate for such, and I don't think the Bible teaches that. I think if you're a Christian, you can't separate certain parts of your life from that. And I think the Bible bears that out. You can see a number of places in Scripture where God used people in the government, like Joseph, like Daniel, like Esther, where they were placed in the government somewhere to have an influence there. And I think God places Christians in government to have influence and to advocate for things that are consistent with His word. And that's what I've tried to do. Many of the things that we did over the last 12 years, which I think have pushed Mississippi forward, were things that were driven by my religious convictions.
So there's obviously a lot of conversation right now already about what the 2027 gubernatorial election is going to look like. You have, sort of a cadre of statewide elected officials that are rumored to be looking at it. State Auditor Shad White, Attorney General Lynn Fitch, Lieutenant Governor Delbert Hosemann. You've got this sort of looming question around Columbia businessman Thomas Duff and whether or not he would get in the race. He is reputed, at least by Forbes, to be the wealthiest man in Mississippi. So a lot of conversation around whether or not he could step in and buy name ID and build an operation quickly. And then there's conversations around folks like Ag Commissioner Andy Gibson, and your name keeps coming up a lot, right? A lot of conversation around, is Philip Gunn going to run or not in 2027? You're here, so I'll just ask you, where is your brain as you hear these things being floated around with your name in them?
Well, I'm flattered by that, obviously, and am certainly interested in that, and am going to look hard at that. I think that people have to ask themselves what they want in a governor, and all those names you mentioned. Every one of those people brings something to the table. I'm not going to sit here and say that those are not good folks and they haven't been good at what they've been doing, serving the state. Everybody brings different gifts and talents and abilities to the table, but I think what the voter has to decide is who best lines up for the office of governor on what do we need in a governor. And for me, it's leadership. I think it just boils down to leadership. You've got to elect the person that you think can work best with the legislature, the person who can cast the vision, not only just cast a vision, but implement that vision. And that's, to me, what it boils down to. And not all the ones that you've mentioned have been in positions of leadership, or at least in positions that require the type of leadership that a governor would have to use to work with the legislature. And I think that's a distinguishing factor. We talked about all the things that have happened over the last 12 years, which I think moved Mississippi forward. The controlled spending, getting the spending under control, and being good with our money to the point that we were able to give a $600 million tax cut 2 years ago, which you were instrumental in, by the way. I want to give you credit for that. You were a big advocate for that. Came and testified at the Capitol for me about that. And this year we saw them pass a bill to eliminate the income tax. That helps our people. That puts money back in their pocket. I think what we did 4 years ago, laid the foundation for the bill that passed this year. We've done workforce development. We've done job creation. We did a road and bridge plan back in 2018. Before we passed that plan, there were over 700 bridges around this state that were closed. Today, there's less than 100. So that plan implemented a great improvement in our state. Our education has moved from 50th to the latest rankings have us as high as 16th. We were able to give the highest teacher pay raise in history. We were able to give money back to the voters. We already talked about, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. We talked about the charter schools that we implemented. We did ESAs. We stopped critical race theory from being taught in the schools. We did nation-leading human trafficking reform. That was a bill I was very proud to sponsor. And we got the bill that we passed has been used as model legislation around the country. We did voter ID. We did a lot to protect the sanctity of our elections. We passed a bill that said non-citizens can't vote. We passed a bill that prevents ballot harvesting. We did voter ID. And then we did, like I said, Roe versus Wade. We changed the state flag. All of those things are things that required leadership. And we go back to talking about the votes. We started this whole conversation, I think, talking about votes, 62 votes. Every time you pass one of these bills, somebody's got to go get those 62 votes. And we did it. So that's a distinguishing thing, I believe.
So when you make a decision, you can come back and have a conversation with us.
I will do that.
We'd welcome to have you back. We've been talking with former House Speaker Philip Gunn, rumored to be in a pool of potential gubernatorial candidates. Lots of interesting conversation here today. Good, authentic conversation, and I always appreciate that. Thank you for coming in.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
The Sit Down is a production of Mississippi Public Broadcasting, Think Radio, made possible thanks to the generous support of listeners just like you. If you enjoy the guests and sit-downs we bring each week, please consider making a contribution to help keep shows like this and many more on the air. Visit mpbonline.org or show your support using the MPB Public Media app. Today's show was produced by the ever-effervescent and wonderful Germaine Flood, or St. Germaine Flood, I should say, over there in the booth, keeping things on lockdown, with live stream by Abram Nanny. For my guest, Philip Gunn, I'm Russ Latino. Stay tuned for Southern Remedy at 11 a.m., always a wonderful program. Like tuning into that, and join us here next week for a new episode of The Sit Down, heard only on MPB Think Radio. If you miss an episode, you can catch us live on the YouTube live stream or wherever you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple, you name it. We'll be back next week. Have a good one.